Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Iraqi residents of the northern autonomous Kurdish region voted earlier this week in a referendum of independence seeking to provide the Kurdistan Regional Government with a mandate to discuss secession from the central government in Baghdad. To further discuss the Kurdish bid for independence and its possible consequences, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Eitan Cohen Yanarocak, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to also welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Nir Boms, who is also a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the chain of events.
Last year we had the Brexit referendum, which was binding. Here we have the Iraqzit, the exit from Iraq referendum, which is more like a public opinion poll conducted by the government of the Kurdish autonomous region. Of course, they knew the answer well in advance, and indeed they received a whopping majority. But now begins the hard part. Now they have to assess whether the balance of interests, the various constraints, the pressures from various sides makes this particular timing appropriate for them to unilaterally announce that they are breaking from Iraq, or whether they can conduct negotiations with the Abadi government in Baghdad in order to facilitate some agreement.
Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, to what extent, what is the depth of this decision to move forward with a referendum?
Well, in this case, I guess the timing is very important. The Kurdish Regional Government and the Peshmerga forces fought against the ISIS, and that gave them the legitimacy, international legitimacy. And in this case, now they also think, as far as I understand, that Iraqi central government is not that strong. And in this case, they would like to seize the opportunity, and they are pushing it forward in order to get this international legitimacy. And in this case, they are playing the game according to the rules, since the United States and its Western allies try to bring democracy to the Middle East. So the Kurds are showing the whole world, look, we are a democratic nation, we are not aggressors, we are not violent, we are going to the poll stations and we are just casting our ballots, and we are like you, we just inherited your democratic values, and please give us what we need. And I guess after these results, we're going to see that the Kurds will go to the Baghdad government and will demand an independence or a roadmap in order to divorce peacefully. But I guess it will going to take like 2 more years, maybe less, that will pave the way for a unilateral independence.
Dr. Boms, if it is such a democratic bid and such a Western-like idea, why do all the countries of the region oppose so sternly toward this move? And why does also the Western society, whether it be the United States or other countries, who voiced concern with regard to such an independence bid?
Well, politics is politics, and we speak about the Middle East. We speak about the Middle East that had seen a fair share of lack of stability, and some of the players around Kurdistan or around the KRG region are very much in the midst of this lack of stability, in the midst of some of the proxy war in Syria, in the midst of lack of stability elsewhere. And if another dimension of tension may enter into this mix. And of course, we will speak about, as I assume, the Turks on the one hand, the Iranians, who certainly do not like it for their own reasons. And they'll have more opportunities or more reasons to have opposition, perhaps a military opposition, which eventually will give them a confrontation with some of their Western allies. And then we have another reasons for war in a region in where the Western allies as well are trying to struggle for stability. And they're basically saying, look, be careful. There is a status quo. It's sort of working. The Kurds have been living with an autonomy, a de facto autonomy. This has been functioning fine for a while. Why do we want to rattle this ship? Let's just let it be.
Mr. Oren, let's focus for a moment to the domestic challenges of this bid. We have, of course, the central government in Baghdad, which has been at war with the Islamic State and has lost most of the parts of its country to a certain extent when it comes to the north. Of course, the KRG, or the Kurdistan Regional Government, has been the most dominant and well-armed group operating in that region, basically controlling some quarter of all the oil production of the country and economically being able to be self-sustainable to a certain degree. And then you have, of course, the Islamic State that has been battling for its own swaths of land. This has now ceased. There are two main groups, the Baghdad central government and the KRG. How can they play here for independence?
There are two notions here, one global and one regional. The global notion is one of secession. And we had cases, Katanga in Congo and Biafra in Nigeria. And then we had Bangladesh breaking from Pakistan. And the question is always, when is it legitimate for a certain province or a certain ethnic group to break from the central government? And if you add to that the colonial heritage, which sometimes created artificial nations out of tribes or districts, which really had nothing with each other, you see the powers at play. In the Middle East, the regional notion is that 100 years ago or so, Great Britain created Iraq, Mesopotamia, out of some artificial groupings. What does Basra, the Shiite region in the south, bordering Iran, what does it have with the Kurds up north? What does the Sunni parts of Baghdad have with other parts? So the Kurds rightly saw an opportunity when the Middle East started to unravel, when the entire Sykes-Picot structure started to come apart. If Syria is coming apart, if people are talking about breaking it to cantons or districts or what have you, why not Iraq regarding the Kurds? And from the Israeli experience, one must admit that if you look 70 years ago at the dilemma David Ben-Gurion faced, there is never a right time for establishing a nation or declaring independence. There are always voices against it. And at the time, President Truman and Secretary Marshall were saying what President Trump and Secretary Tillerson are saying today, always counseling, restraint, wait for a better opportunity. But President Barzani is right to seize the moment. As you said, there's an opportunity. There will be difficulties, but it is right for him to do it.
Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, nevertheless, the Iraqi Prime Minister in Baghdad, Haider al-Abadi, continues to be very anti anything to do with independence. He's very wary of losing a quarter of the country's production, particularly in the oil, which is the biggest form of income for this country. How can it agree to such a move at such a time like this when the country is trying to rebuild after years of war?
Well, I must admit that I really don't think that they will agree. The Iranians and the Shiites in Iraq will try to maximize their own influence on the oil fields and on the Kurdish region. But on the other hand, the Kurds are not, of course, eager to go under such an influence. And in this case, the name of the game here is who is going to be the aggressor. The Kurds are trying to, they are doing their best in order not to be stamped as an aggressor. So they are always emphasizing that this is democracy and we are non-violent. We are trying to resolve our differences through dialogue and with a roadmap and diplomacy. But on the other hand, the Iraqis are sending their army in order to carry out a joint military drill with Turkey next to the Turkish-Iraqi border, which is a clear message for the Kurdish Peshmerga. On the other hand, I would like to also refer to the Turkish military. In this case, I do see this maneuver as an internal domestic Turkish policy thing rather than the Turkish foreign policy.
We'll get to that in a
Sure.
few moments as we discuss also Turkey's approach to this matter. Dr. Boms, the Kurds have been quite upfront with it. This is actually getting the people's mandate in order to move forward for dialogue with Baghdad. Why does now Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi move forward and say, this is a unilateral move, we will fight to the death pretty much in order to make sure that this never happens?
Well, mainly because it was a unilateral move. The Iraqi government have not approved this referendum. They were not for it, and they had asked and demanded that it's not going to happen. So they're looking at it, probably justifiably so, as a unilateral move. As my colleagues had said, there are a number of interests there. There is oil, but there's also the basic interest of keeping the sovereign country and really keeping politics in power. If we're going to have a secession of one region, then we'll have other regions. Iraq is also far from being united or homogenous for that matter. And all of that certainly gives the Iraqi government a good reason to say stop, particularly also because the Kurds are aligned with the West. Iraq, particularly at this particular point in time, is aligned with Iran. These two interests, again, collide. And therefore, the Iraqi response is certainly one to be expected. But again, talks is cheap. Then the issue is what's going to happen next.
Well, Mr. Oren, we're already hearing, of course, about the joint maneuver between Turkey and the Iraqi militaries, which was already one step in the direction of conflagration to a certain extent. And we hear also, both from Ankara and Tehran, a massive support to the government, the central government in Baghdad. How do we see this actually evolve to the point where they actually come and might actually wage war?
We can't really predict because it's not linear. Today's coalition could tomorrow turn into bitter enemies. The Kurds, along with the Iraqi army and certain militias and forces, fought side by side to liberate Mosul. And Mosul is one of the biggest prizes still in contention because it's not singularly Kurd. It has many ethnic groups. There is also, of course, the question of who is going to govern which bloc in the city. But nevertheless, the alliances shift. And today, Turkey is probably an ally of Haider al-Abadi. We also have the talks between Russia and Turkey, Putin and Erdogan. But then again, Putin plans to be against Iran the day after tomorrow, when the fight over Syria is going to heat up once Bashar al-Assad stays in power for good. So I wouldn't see too much into it, but I would point out, if I want to go back to my example of establishing Israel 70 years
Please.
ago, in the Declaration of Independence that David Ben-Gurion read, he mentioned that the Jews, that is the Israelis to be, fought in World War II alongside the Allies, the so-called Jewish Brigade Group. The analogy is to the Kurds fighting against ISIS. They won the right to independence. They also won arms and other support, but they won the right to get their independence because they were the most skilled, the most effective group fighting on the side of the coalition on the ground. So it will be very hard, even though the Americans are now saying, please don't do it, wait. It will be very hard for the Americans to go head-to-head against them.
Dr. Cohen, Yanarocak, when we're talking about Turkey, a country that actually all of the economic dealings of the Kurdistan Regional Government go through the Turkish territorial lands, whether it be the pipelines or the other angles. There are about 1,300 Turkish companies currently operating within this Kurdish regions. What is this domestic issue that you're talking about that is challenging the Ankara government from moving forward and actually accepting a Kurdish country.
Okay, nowadays Mr. Erdogan is strengthening his position at home thanks to an alliance, and this alliance is forged with the Turkish nationalists. Nowadays, there is an opposition in that camp, and Mrs. Meral Akşener, who is a very charismatic figure, is going to, as far as I understand, she's going to establish a new political party. And according to the latest surveys, she is already getting very high statistics, and this is frightening Mr. Erdogan. So when it comes to the nationalist Turks, when there's a problem with the Kurds, if you're going to, be the Turkish hero, if you're not going to let the Kurds to have their own states, or if you're going to impose on them some sanctions, if you're going to punish them, and if you're going to make some populistic statements, so it will turn as a very good result in the ballot box for Mr. Erdogan. So in this case, maybe in the short run, he's against the Kurdish independence, but in the long run, I really believe that it's for the Turkey's interests such a state, and I can justify this point of view by stating that this newly potential Kurdish state will be bound to Turkey by all means, because this KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, is a landlocked entity, and it's very much dependent to Turkey. And they would like to become a part of the West, and they don't want to become a part of the East. And when we are looking at the map, what do we see? In the West, we have Syria. In the South, we have Iraq. And in the East, we have Iran. And only in the North, we have Turkey. So in this case, the Kurds are naturally see Turkey as a member of NATO and as a member of the Western camp, and they do all in order to become aligned with this country. And one more thing, despite the fact that the Kurds are not defining themselves on the basis of religion and sects, the Kurds are Sunnis, and they are more closer, to Turkey, because the Turkish state is also a Sunni state. And in this respect, Turkey would like to see a closer relationship with KRG, but on the other hand, it doesn't want to see the Iranian Shiite influence coming to KRG, and that's why Turkey wants to keep the status quo. It doesn't want to see a change, but it also doesn't want to see a very hard and blunt Baghdad's government influence in the north of the country.
Well, of course, also there is a very small Kurdish population of Shiites in Iran. But Dr. Boms, when we're talking about Masoud Barzani, the president of the Kurdistan Regional Government, we're talking about a person who has had very good relations with Turkey, specifically also with the government of Ankara. He was or received an honorary citizenship from Turkey years ago and has been aligned with Turkish policy for many, many years, which has actually deteriorated his position with the Kurds in Turkey itself and to a certain extent also in Syria. How do you see this different approach to the Turkish government influencing what is happening today in Erbil and the other Kurdish cities?
Well, to continue what my colleague just spoke about, there are a number of important issues between the KRG and Turkey, and one of them is also the Kurdish community in Turkey. And the Kurdish minority in Turkey is a part of this dynamic and a part that helps explain the Turkish policy, because again, part of it is understanding that every time we attempt, particularly in the Middle East, to change the status quo, we are risking ourselves in another war. And Turkey had seen a very active Kurdish resistance, a very active separatist movement, and they certainly would not like to strengthen that, particularly if it will come on the expense of Turkey. It's different if it comes on the expense of another Kurdish independent state that at some point Erdogan could say, well, look, if you want to really be an independent Kurd, just go there, just leave us alone.
You were talking also about the alignment between the central government in Baghdad and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Give us a little bit of an understanding. How much of a challenge is this move for the Islamic Republic?
Well, if we have a new country in the Middle East that is Western, that is armed by the Americans, that will very quickly will have alliances with some of the countries that, including Israel, that Iran is very much on the other side of. It's a very difficult issue for them. They have weapons, they have support, and this is really a very big victory for the other side. So this is about the axis that is pulling together and saying, no, we have to prevent it, perhaps at all cost.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to give you the opportunity. You were setting down an analogy between Kurdistan and the potential declaration of independence with the Israeli bid some 70 years ago. What are the chances of the Kurdish government actually stepping up and saying, okay, we wanted to provide ourselves with a mandate to talk with Baghdad, but they refused, so here we are and we're declaring independence?
I think the chances are very good that after a year or so of going through the motions, and of course, provided that the situation in the Middle East in general and in Syria in particular is favorable to them, they will do it. And partly this is because they do see Israel as an example. Israel, since the early 1960s, when, as one former Mossad officer said, Mullah Mustafa Barazani was penniless in Paris, didn't even have money for a cup of tea when he knocked on the door of the Israeli mission and asked for help. And obviously Israel did connect with the Kurds, and you mentioned the Iranian-Kurdish relationship now. At the time, of course, under the Shah, it was very useful for the Shah, as it was for Israel, to distract Iraq on the Iraqi-Iranian border, thereby enabling Israel to be relatively free of Iraqi expeditionary forces during its wars. Now, over the last couple of years, there were several statements by Prime Minister Netanyahu, several ministers, outgoing Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, General Yair Golan, who not only came out for independence for Kurdistan, but also for the PKK. He went much further than any other official. And only this week, the former Director General of the Foreign Ministry and the former Ambassador to the UN, Ron Prosor, had an op-ed article coming out strongly for Kurdish independence. So Israel does see Kurdistan as an ally, and there is some reason for it too. Iraq is the only Arab country not to have signed the armistice agreements in 1949. There was some hope after Saddam Hussein was toppled that this will be rectified, but the Americans were not able to do it. So Israel has no stake in Iraq staying as a country, even though, of course, it doesn't want Iran to overtake it. But Iran does have influence on Baghdad anyway. So from the Israeli point of view, let there be a Kurdistan.
Dr. Cohen, Yanarocak, when we're talking about the potential declaration of independence, if the negotiations fail, how would Turkey react to that?
Okay, in the long run, we may see sanctions. They already closed down the Habur gateway, the land border. But still, we have the Turkish Airlines flying from Istanbul to Erbil. And in this case, we have seen also before, like the Turkish government shut down the border in order to punish the Kurdistan Regional Government for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We may see such a thing. But in this case, nobody is talking right now in Turkey closing down the pipeline. I mean, maybe people will not pass the border, but eventually the oil will pass. So in this case, it is signaling that the Turkish government will soften its policy when it comes to the Kurdistan Regional Government in the future. That's my assumption. Of course, I may be mistaken.
Dr. Boms, when we're talking about the Islamic Republic, same question?
Well, I think Iran is not going to take it so lightly, but eventually Iran will have to see what is it that can be done. If they'll decide to act militarily and then again risking another front, it's maybe something very difficult for them. We have to again take something in mind, at least in perspective. We have 193 countries today and a number of other countries that contend to be countries. If we go back to the Second World War, we only had 55 countries at the end of it. And countries have learned to live with other countries. It's never easy to change a status quo, but if the Kurds will continue to prove that they're able to govern, to self-rule, and eventually, perhaps more than that, the Iranians will have to live with that.
Mr. Oren, the last point when we're talking about Israel, do you believe that Israel will actively pursue assisting Masoud Barzani and the Kurdish government in establishing a state, and if so, in what ways may we expect it?
It is very probable. There are ties already with visits between the leadership and the professional echelons of both countries. And obviously, Israel can pull some strings in Washington and elsewhere. And because the issue of Kurdistan being landlocked was mentioned, there are two models of landlocked countries. One is Afghanistan and one is Switzerland. And whether Kurdistan will become an Afghanistan or Switzerland also depends on the way the region acts towards it. Israel will do its best to legitimize Kurdistan.
And additional, you were talking about Washington. How will the United States actually act in Kurdish assistance or against a Kurdish bid, as well as the European Union?
Well, the Americans like the present government in Baghdad. They much prefer it to the governments which preceded it ever since the war.
Even though it's alignment with Iran, as Dr.
Yes,
Bohm mentioned?
but the alignment with Iran helped them kick the Daesh forces out of Mosul and now fighting in Raqqa. The war is not over in Tel Afar, in Nineveh province, and other places. But nevertheless, they like Abadi and they don't want to undercut him. So their declarations are in line with his policy. But once it's a fact that Kurdistan is there to stay, they will support it.
Another actor that we didn't talk about in borders, Iraq, Syria, Dr. Boms?
Well, Syria is an important border country also because it has a significant Kurdish population. This particular population just had in Rojava, in the northern part of Syria, elections, the very first elections for local municipalities. The area there is controlled by another party, the PDK, a rival party to the KRG. Nevertheless, the very fact that they are now able to assert additional level of independence or autonomy. And we have heard recent statements from the Syrian Foreign Ministry saying that they're willing to accept it and negotiate that arrangement and accept that de facto level of additional degree of autonomy is something that works very well for the Kurdish card. They're the only ones in the Middle East that are really able to do this, to establish what seems to be a democratic system, a functioning system, and a system that can provide an example, perhaps, for others.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Eitan Cohen Yanarocak, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Nir Boms for coming here today, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.